So the pedogenesis of a technosol is unique to a technosol. All soils have a development trajectory, things which act upon them and move them in a certain direction. But with technosols, certain things are happening, kind of a meeting of a lot of coincidences, I guess. And so part of it would be the same time that we are starting to create these soils coincides with a generally favorable global climate. It basically means that we're not in an ice age. And so, since we're not in an ice age, it's generally warm enough for things to develop. Because one of the great things that does develop a soil, it causes this differentiation of horizons, is biological activity. And biological activity is controlled by temperature. A lot less biological activity, especially in the soil when you're talking about the ice age. Something else is that these materials which are put into these technosols are typically very chemically reactive. So this means that they're ready for development right now. That they're going to decompose into different things pretty quickly, and that decomposition is going to be fuel for this biological activity. And so we're seeing hand in hand not only chemically reactive materials, but also, of course, following that is this high biological activity. And then something which I missed talking about earlier, but when we're saying low erosion, technosols typically don't have very much in the way of erosion because, again, they cost a lot of money, it's a lot of money to make a technosol. And so what happens is that people typically, first they'll make this bed, they'll fill it with highly chemically reactive material, like really good compost or whatever, because they really want to grow things. And then after they've made this bed, they protect it somehow. Usually they're covering it. Sometimes they'll put hoops over it. Maybe it's for the crops or not. And then, but ultimately what's happening is that rainfall is being protected from this area. The material, since it is encased inside within the frame of this bed, it's got nowhere to run. And so low erosion counts, and with low erosion, a soil can develop. If a soil was eroding, if all this stuff was running out, then we just wouldn't, eventually we just don't have a soil left to develop because it's all eroding away. Bam! There's no pedogenesis because there's no soil. There's no soil development because there's no soil. And so keeping your soil particles where you want them, having them within a bed, somehow constrained, protected against erosion, and keeping the material here is one way that you get rapid pedogenesis of technosols. All right, we're going to take one more look at a constructed technosol just to examine a couple more points and we'll move on. So I want to relay something that Hafiz et al. Found or documented in 2012. They investigated this layering of technosols, and they found that with increasing depth, just going down the soil profile, they found decreasing bioactivity. Basically something kind of like this. You have the most biological activity on the top and slowly decreasing as it gets toward the bottom. Maybe it should have been more, maybe a more gradual arc, something like that. It doesn't matter, whatever it was. Highest biological activity at top, lower at bottom. And this is pretty classic. This is what you find in natural soil orders as well, is that most of the food for biological activity is is contained in organic matter being deposited, be it leaf litter or something like that, falling to the top. And so most of the stuff that lives there is going to be up near the top where all the food is. Something else that they did find, though, is that due to this layering, they found distinct genetic fingerprints for different microbial communities as they went down the soil profile. So not only were most of the activity in the top branches, but also the distinct communities, like there was X, Y, and Z here, but then there was just X and A here, and then there was only B, and then there was C and D here, or something like that. So on one hand, technosols act like natural soil orders, biological activity decreases as you go down, but on the other, they reflect the filtering aspect of the urban environment itself, right? In the urban environment, things have to come from nature and work their way into the urban core. Similarly, here we have these filters. If all the bioactivity is starting from the top, stuff is falling out of the air even, yeast or bacteria or whatever is falling out of the air and landing on the soil, fungi, something. They are colonizing this area where most of the food is, but there's a hard filter. As this changes, as the substrate changes, as the media changes, not everything is able to move on to the next realm. So a bunch of stuff shows up, right? We've got this big thick arrow shows up, but then we see that it's a bit thinner when it goes down, and then it's a bit thinner when it goes down, and then it's kind of quite faint. So two things happening, right? In the very bottom of a Technosol, very low activity because there's low food, and then even lower activity because of this filtering effect. All right, one last part about pedogenesis. When it comes to Technosols, as we've seen, humans are creating them, and thus the intent that we come into it with really dictates what happens with these Technosols. And so generally, artificial urban soils, Technosols, follow kind of one or two paths for pedogenesis. They're either typically kind of decorative for parks or something like that, in which case, really, there's a surprising amount of sand in these soils. It's basically all sand. Some research by a colleague of mine, Neil Bell, has assessed a lot of green spaces of Technosols in the Portland area, and their sand levels are just astronomical. Like most of them, about 80%. It's hardly really a soil. It's a sand, really. It's almost like they're planting trees into a playground sandbox. It's not really the greatest. Then the other end is for productive use. This goes to the other extreme. This tends to be incredibly high in organic matter and also tends to receive fertilizer inputs. And this came from my research, basically just looking into urban gardens, urban created soils, urban Technosols, and be it in-ground or raised beds. The organic matter was pretty intense. Like I think the average was something, I want to say 13%, when most agriculture suggests, something like 4 to 6%, depending on who you ask. So my average was twice the upper range, and I even had my highest report 33%. Basically, like this is straight compost. It's 1/3 carbon, 1/3 organic matter. This is crazy. These plants burned and died before the end of the year. So you can see these very, very different, depending on what someone wants to do with it. They're either trying to get it as cheaply as they can because it's just supposed to be some amenity for something else, just some green space slapped on the side somewhere. Or they're trying to make something of it and they kind of go overboard because, again, remember, we can affect everything incredibly strongly. Us right here. And so it's really easy to affect whatever you want and to make something incredibly rich if you'd like. And so this shows the differences in Technosols. You can have basically a sandbox and you can have basically a compost box, and they would both be considered Technosols because they were created soils.